This video was brought to you by Brilliant. On Monday, after months of deliberations and failed attempts, the United Nations Security Council finally adopted a resolution demanding a ceasefire in Gaza, after the US dropped its veto and abstained on the vote instead. With the war in Gaza approaching its 6th month, the Security Council resolution is the highest level demand for a ceasefire and highlights Israel's increasing diplomatic isolation. So in this video, we're going to explain the context and substance of the Security Council resolution, what it means in practice, and the significant impact it could have on the already strained US-Israel relationship. Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop and be notified when we release new videos. Let's get straight into it and take a look at what this Security Council resolution, which was brought forward by the 10 elected non-permanent members, actually says. The key line is that the Security Council demands an immediate ceasefire for the month of Ramadan, respected by all parties, leading to a lasting, sustainable ceasefire, and also demands the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages. It also emphasizes the need to expand the inflow of humanitarian assistance into Gaza, and demands the lifting of all barriers to this, as well as demanding that all parties comply with their obligations under international law. Ultimately, the vote on Monday saw 14 of the Security Council's 15 members vote in favor, while the US abstained. Here's the moment when it happened.
I shall put the draft resolution to the vote now. Please raise their hand. Those against? Abstention. The result of the voting is as follows: 14 votes in favor, 0 vote against, 1 abstention. The draft resolution has been adopted as Resolution 2728, 2024.
Now, obviously, the US abstaining on the resolution isn't exactly an endorsement of it, but it was enough for the resolution to pass. And it's worth pointing out that an abstention does represent a notable change in American policy. For context, before this resolution, the United States vetoed 3 prior draft resolutions relating to a Gaza ceasefire. The first was in October, when Brazil put forward a resolution calling for humanitarian pauses, which the US vetoed for not mentioning Israel's right to self-defense. The second was in December and demanded an immediate humanitarian ceasefire, which the US vetoed for not explicitly naming and condemning Hamas. And finally, in February, the US vetoed an Algerian resolution, which also demanded an immediate humanitarian ceasefire, which the US vetoed because it would, quote, put sensitive negotiations in jeopardy. During this same time, the US has also had its own 2 Gaza-related resolutions vetoed by both China and Russia, most recently just this month, for not directly demanding an immediate ceasefire. Anyway, the Palestinian representative at the UN welcomed the resolution, but said that it was long overdue. Hamas, meanwhile, also welcomed the resolution and said that it was willing to, quote, engage in an immediate prisoner exchange process that leads to the release of prisoners on both sides. Israel, however, has insisted that it will not cease fire and criticized the Security Council for passing what it called a resolution that called for a ceasefire without conditioning it on the release of hostages. So, why did the US finally drop its veto and allow this resolution to be adopted? Well, in terms of the wider conflict, it comes after months of pressure from within President Biden's own party, and also from allies abroad, to get the US to constrain Israel's military action in Gaza, which has now killed more than 32,000 Palestinians and injured nearly 75,000. The situation in Gaza has also been described by the Red Cross as desperate and an unbearable human tragedy, with a famine looming and the more than 2 million population experiencing food insecurity at crisis levels or above. Efforts by the US government, both behind the scenes and publicly, to convince the Israeli government to scale back its military offensive and lift restrictions on humanitarian aid into Gaza have so far largely failed. So within this context, and against the backdrop of the humanitarian catastrophe, it looks like the US government has realized that continuing to veto ceasefire resolutions is not a sustainable position, and that it has to increase pressure on Israel to act. Speaking about the US decision to abstain and let the resolution be adopted, US Secretary of State Antony Blinken said that while we do not agree with all provisions included in this text, adjustments made are consistent with our principled position that any ceasefire text must be paired with text on the release of hostages. It also, Blinken said, explicitly recognized the painstaking, non-stop negotiations being conducted by the governments of Egypt, Israel, Qatar, and the United States to achieve such a release in the context of a ceasefire. However, he did add that because the final text does not have key language we view as essential, notably the condemnation of Hamas, we could not support it. So, practically speaking, what does this mean for the situation on the ground in Gaza? Well, UN Security Council resolutions are legally binding, but there's effectively no enforcement mechanism, and it doesn't seem like anyone really expects the demands of the resolution to be met. Israel, for example, insists that it will not cease fire. Nevertheless, UN Security General Antonio Guterres said failure to implement the resolution would be unforgivable. But even if a ceasefire were to be implemented per the resolution's demand, Ramadan ends around the 9th of April, meaning said ceasefire would only last 2 weeks. That being said, the resolution does say that a Ramadan ceasefire should lead to a lasting, sustainable ceasefire. Anyway, despite the adoption of the resolution likely not changing much on the ground in Gaza, it could have serious ramifications for the increasingly strained relationship between Israel and its staunchest ally, the United States. In response to the US's abstention, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu called it a clear retreat from the previous US position and claimed that the abstention would hurt the Israeli war effort and attempts to release hostages. He also cancelled a planned visit by an Israeli delegation to the US in retaliation. In turn, the White House said that it was disappointed and kind of perplexed by this decision. Biden and Netanyahu have had a long and at times difficult working relationship, and the two administrations have been at odds on a number of issues even before October 7th. But this is probably the biggest rupture between Biden and Netanyahu since the war in Gaza began, and it likely won't remain the biggest for long. That's because the two allied countries are on a collision course over Israel's plans to invade Rafah, a town on Gaza's southern border with Egypt, now home to well more than 1 million Palestinians. That's more than half of Gaza's total population, who have been displaced by violence elsewhere in the Strip. Despite significant international pressure, Benjamin Netanyahu has said that Israel will go ahead with the plans to invade Rafah, saying that the military must do so to defeat Hamas. One Israeli minister said that the invasion of Rafah will go ahead even if the entire world turns on Israel, including the United States. Vice President Kamala Harris, meanwhile, said that the Biden administration had made it clear to the Israeli government that any major military operation in Rafah would be a huge mistake, adding that she would not rule out consequences if it went ahead. Exactly what those consequences might be remains to be seen. For example, there are calls within the Democratic Party for the US to begin conditioning its military assistance for Israel based on its actions in Gaza and its adherence to international law. Ultimately, though, we'll have to wait and see how the US responds. Now, understanding what exactly is going to happen here is a little tricky, requiring you to evaluate a lot of different information from often partial sources. It'll be sensible then to begin improving your own critical thinking skills so that you can stay sharp and better understand what's going on. And, well, our sponsor, Brilliant.org, can help you do exactly that. Brilliant is the online learning platform that's designed specifically to teach you everything from maths, data analysis, programming, and AI from the ground up. You don't need a fancy degree or to have dedicated hundreds of hours to studying any of these topics. All you need is a device with an internet connection and a spare few minutes a day. And with those few minutes, you'll be learning by actually doing. Because Brilliant allows you hands-on lessons that allow you to play around with concepts. a method that has been shown to be 6 times more effective than just watching lectures. What makes this even better is that this content is created by an award-winning team of teachers, researchers, and professionals from MIT, Caltech, Duke, Microsoft, and more. You can try everything that Brilliant has to offer for free for a full 30 days by clicking the link in the description. That way, you'll also get 20% off an annual premium subscription.